Welcome everyone. My name is Stephen Goodman and I'm the Program Director for Asian Philosophies and Cultures here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. For how many of you is this your first visit to CIIS? Let's see. Okay, welcome. May it not be your last. We're hopeful that a video version of tonight will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And so also, if you're interested in other cultural events, culture and philosophy, we do on a regular basis have events here, free and open to the public. And we will have that ancient method of writing your names down, email, or whatever you like. And so we can stay in touch that way. It's wonderful that Father Tiso is here, and I'm trying to remember how it happened that we got reconnected again on Facebook. I'm not remembering, but anyway, it doesn't matter. One of the most memorable times I remember meeting him was when he gave a lecture on this topic, rainbow body and resurrection, at IONS, Institute of Noetic Science, 2001. And of course he's well known as a scholar and as a practitioner, and really brings in his new book, Rainbow Body and Resurrection, Spiritual Attainment, The Dissolution of the Material Body, and the Case of Khenpo A Cho. Really a very substantial book that's already generating a lot of controversy, which is a British way of saying interest. And I want to give sort of a formal introduction. If you saw the flyer, Father Francis Tiso holds an A.B. in Medieval Studies from Cornell University, a Master of Divinity from Harvard University, and a doctorate from Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary, where his specialization was Buddhist studies. And he is a priest in the Diocese of Isernia Venafro, Italy. And so really it's a great honor to hear Father Tiso speak in a language other than Italian for this lay audience here, and please give a warm welcome to Father Tiso.
Well, it's good to see you, and please have a seat. Welcome. I've been giving talks for the past 5 days here in the Bay Area, and so this evening we have an opportunity to, in some respects, repeat the research that I've been presenting, but also I think we can look at it with a new point of view, because CIIS is a very special place, and it gives us an opportunity to look more carefully at some of the themes of the book. Okay. Now, I think the way I'm going to do this this evening, to go through an outline that introduces the book. And let me know if you have any trouble hearing me, because I'll speak more loudly. Because the book, in a way, is designed as a kind of literary experience. At one point I compare it to a Mahler symphony, in which themes are introduced and developed in different ways until you come to a conclusion that, of course, points us beyond itself. And so that's the way I'd like to speak this evening, using some support from the PowerPoint, the slides that document some of our research, and then allow an hour of time for our conversation about this topic. And that way you have an opportunity to share your own reflections. I hope some of you will consider living the experience of the book for yourself. The book is a work of art. It's supposed to be a work of art. And the whole process is an opportunity for us to look at the meaning of death in a particular tradition, in a particular culture, which was not closed off and closed in on itself, but which was in contact in many key moments with other cultures nearby. Tibet, you might say, is the center of a mandala. They like to think of themselves as the center of a mandala. But being at the center of a mandala means being in relationship to the periphery of the mandala, absolutely. And so we're going to see some surprising consequences of that openness and that conversation. A real encounter of civilizations that occurred at a number of points in the history of Buddhism, but in particular around the 8th century. So let's have a look. Here's the cover of the book. We have some copies over here on the table. And here's the subject of the book. This is a somewhat blurred photograph of Khenpo A Cho. His name means the practice of the sound or letter A, long A. All right? And he has another long name we won't mention for you. But he was a very, very unusual monk from eastern Tibet, from the county of Nyarong, in what it used to be called Kan, the eastern part of Tibet, which is now incorporated into the province of Sichuan in the People's Republic of China. And he lived for about 82 years. He was brought up in the Nyingma tradition, the old lineage going back to imperial Tibet in the 8th century, which underwent a number of transformations over the centuries. And then at a certain point in his young adulthood, he decided to go to Lhasa and study philosophy with the great Gelugpa masters, who were also the teachers of the Dalai Lamas. Right, so that he entered into the most scholastic and strongly monastic tradition of Tibetan Buddhism and participated fully. In fact, he was already ordained as a Nyingma monk in his village, Lomaga in Nyarong, but then he went to Lhasa and he was encouraged to take ordination again in the Gelugpa lineage, something that is rather unusual. And when he returned to his village, having brought back nothing of material value, there was a bit of controversy. People said, you didn't come back with anything in your pocket, and not only that, but you're going around giving teachings that sound to us like those other guys, those Gelugpa people, and so you're going to turn our nice little Nyingma temple into a Gelugpa temple. We're not so thrilled about that. So the sectarian bias is there. But the biography tells us that instead of being bothered by this, he just went on and gave teachings to everyone he could find. He visited monastery after monastery and gave teachings in both lineages. And he was known already as a young man as an extraordinary practitioner as well as a scholar. Brigands were converted to a life of virtue. Animals were attracted to him. He was a man of classic saintly virtue. And he also took on very few disciples. He taught many people, but the intimate disciples were few. And apparently his most intimate disciples were a community of nuns who have a monastery on the bank of the river that is just south of the town of Kanze in eastern Tibet. And some of you may know from newspaper reports that monks and lay people in the town of Kanze in recent years have done self-immolation to protest the oppressive regime. But at the time that we were there in 2000, actually, the situation was relatively amicable. There was surveillance on the part of the Chinese military. The large Gelugpa monastery at the center of the town of Kanze was under surveillance, but did not really have its life dramatically impeded by the Chinese presence. As you know, in the 1950s, it was this part of Tibet that rose in rebellion against the Chinese invasion. And so there was always surveillance and punishment, severe punishment, for anyone who might express views that were in contrast to the official policies of the state. But at the time that we were there, everything was relatively pacific and tranquil. And so we met with these nuns. But let me just tell you a little bit of the story of approaching the town of Kanza. I had no idea really where to go. I knew where Kanza was. I knew where Nyadong was because that had been described for us by a medical doctor who lives in Switzerland, Dr. Sagan, who I will show you in a moment. But as we approached the monastery, I wasn't quite sure. This is an enormous structure. And I don't know if you know anything about large Tibetan monasteries, but they consist of several central buildings that are quite large. But then there is usually a village of smaller houses all around them, where individual monks and their disciples, very often relatives, their nephews, are living together and practicing and studying together under the guidance of an older monk. So there is this village with several large buildings in the middle for the major ceremonies of the community. Where to go? My intrepid collaborators are behind me, wondering if I completely lost my mind because I seem to be going in a direction that they don't agree with. But I said, let's go this way. We all go off to the left. We reach a gate, and waiting for us mysteriously at the gate is a young man named Tashi with the classic Khenpo cowboy hat. He's a young layman who is just there, as it were, waiting for us to show up. And he says, in a few words, I'll take you to the people who can help you out. And within moments, we are ushered into the presence of several of the elder monks of the community who almost immediately produce the biography, 8 chapters of the biography of the Khenpo. Well, this is pretty tremendous relief because it saves us a lot of questions and answers. And they told us some of the things that they knew about him. They didn't give us the 9th chapter. The 9th chapter is the story of his attainment of the dissolution of the material body, or the rainbow body, at the time of his death. We were advised to go across the river and meet with the nuns, because the nuns had the 9th chapter. The nuns had the 9th chapter, and we did that. But what this also illustrates is that for his brothers in the Gelugpa order, the dissolution of the body and the attainment of the rainbow body were not part of the curriculum, not part of the path, the gradual path, the Lamrim, that is typical of that tradition. Therefore, it was not spoken about. And later, when we interviewed one of the Rinpoches, one of the heads of that monastery, he too spoke with brotherly affection of this holy monk, who was his dear friend. And I will describe later their encounter, their exchange, a few months before the death of the Khenpo. But there was nothing about the rainbow body. This was not to be spoken about. Okay? So that the sectarian divisions are quite clear that in the Nyingma tradition, in the practice of what is called the great perfection, Dzogchen, this is an attainment. This is recognized as an attainment. And it fits in with the Dzogchen curriculum of practice, but also, of course, with the notion of what Buddhahood is in that lineage. But it doesn't correspond necessarily to some of the other tantric lineages, which do speak of an illusory body, which do speak of a light body, which do speak of a subtle body, but do not speak of it in terms of the dissolution of the material body. Okay. Sometimes you will see, as in the life of Milarepa, I wrote a book called Liberation in One Lifetime, which traces some of the earliest biographies and teachings of Milarepa that have come down to us. In that book, you see that Milarepa was able to incinerate his own body at the time of his death. There were 2 towns that were rivals and disciples. You know, they were making offerings to Milarepa and his disciples. And in that rivalry, there was danger of violence to fight over the relics of his cremated body. So one town wanted to steal the body and burn it in their town. And so the disciples made sure that the body was between the 2 towns, and then spontaneously from the heart chakra, a flame emerged to consume the body. And this is, among other things, it's a symbol of the fact that Milarepa's own attainment of enlightenment was key to his practice of the heat yoga known as Dumo. Okay? The Dumo heat yoga is not only to warm you when you're in a cold cave in the Himalayas, as some people have said. It's actually a method for bringing about enlightenment. And the means known as Dumo is to bring the energy of the body, the 5 winds that they're called, into the central channel of the subtle body in such a way as to awaken physical warmth, but also to increasingly focalize and render subtle the abiding of consciousness in the subtle channel, in the central channel of the subtle body. This is, Milarepa himself calls this the Taplam, the path of means. Right? And he has, if you read that book, you'll see some wonderful descriptions of methods for bringing that about. But he definitely focused on that, and of course at the end of his life he was able to manifest this paranormal cremation, right? And thereby did not leave any relics behind. And in fact, it was a total conflagration of his material remains. But the conflagration is not quite the same thing as the dissolution of the body into its atoms or into the subatomic particles of light that are claimed for the Dzogchen practitioners. Okay? So, why did I undertake this research? Back in 1999, when I was associate pastor at St. Bernard's Parish up in Eureka, I had a message from my own spiritual teacher, my main spiritual teacher, Brother David Steindl-Rast. Do any of you know him? Benedictine monk, yeah, very well known in the Bay Area for his work with San Francisco Zen Center, among other groups, Tassajara and Great Gulch. And Brother David said that he had heard from his friend Vanja Palmers, who was the fellow on the right of the slide, that there had been a case of the dissolution of the body in eastern Tibet, and that this information had been transmitted to Vanja by Dr. Chitse-Gyat. It was a doctor in a psychiatric institution near Zurich, who was Tibetan and comes from Yadong. So he said, get in the plane. I happened to be in Italy at the time. Get on the plane, go to Zurich, and Vanja will give you some money to get to Tibet and start doing some research on this. So, you know, when our spiritual teacher tells us to do something, we are more than happy to obey. And in this case, of course, it was very exciting because this is not like watering a stick that has no signs of any kind of life in it and hoping that it will sprout, shoots. This is, doing what I was trained to do. So off I go. And so met with Vanja and Dr. Chutsegan and proceeded to a preliminary trip to Tibet, very briefly that summer, and then planning things for the following summer, a more complete expedition of research that would involve interviews of the eyewitnesses. And the Tibetan doctor was kind enough to explain who were the people who might be able to help us, their names, their location, how we might get there, and so forth. So we had to do this. So already the model of research that I was developing was a model of interviews and, to some extent, participant observer in the classic tradition of cultural anthropology. So the following summer, making our way from research in northern Nepal on a separate project, we were studying the Tanka paintings of the Tarak Valley in Dolpo, which is a region of Nepal on the Tibetan border that has been already studied by David Snellgrove and by Cornel Geste and a number of other very distinguished anthropologists. So we went there to make careful notes on the scroll paintings, the tankas, that are found in 7 temples in that valley. And we made some photographs, and we were preparing to publish something on that, something that is a project that remains unfinished. but it was definitely a wonderful experience because I had already been to Dolpo in 1997. So going back in 2000, all of my old friends were there. They welcomed us back. We were accompanied by all the lamas in the neighborhood to measure and photograph all the tankas, and some of the lamas even today are great painters. So they were showing us their techniques and all of that. The beauty of that was that we were at 4,200 meters and above sea level. And as a result, by the time we got to eastern Tibet, which is about 3,700 meters, we were acclimatized. And we could move around and do research and clarity of mind and vigor of body. Whereas if we had gone directly to eastern Tibet, we would not have been so fortunate. So we arrived at Kanza, and we proceeded with the help of a land cruiser to get somewhat close to the village of Nyarong, the village of Lomaga in the county of Nyarong. But the river had washed out most of the roads after a certain point, so we had to go on foot. It was about a 3-hour hike. And then we got to this magnificent spot in the countryside above Lomaga, which is the little hermitage made out of wood where Khenpo A Cho did most of his spiritual practice, most of the activities that gave rise to the manifestation of the dissolution of the body. One of the things that is important for us to remember in his biography, I've translated a portion of the biography in my book, is that at a certain point in his life, he was invited by the great Dudjom Rinpoche, one of the greatest Nyingma masters of the 20th century, to participate in a Vajrakilaya initiation. Now, some of you may know what this is. This is the initiation wherein the practitioner is instructed in the use of a mantra and the use of a ritual implement called a purba. Maybe I can draw this. This kind of schematic drawing of the purba. It's a kind of ritual dagger. They're usually the heads of deities on it and so forth. The purba is one of the most ancient ritual objects in human history. They found purbas going back to Babylon. There's a great deal of study that's been dedicated to the history of the use of ritual daggers, because one of the meanings of purba is also tent peg. Now remember, in the Old Testament, who used a tent peg to slaughter the enemy? Do you remember this story? It's Judith and Holofernes, right? When she hammers the tent peg into the temple of this enemy of the people of Israel. All right, so the tent peg is a symbolic object for destroying evil. And so it is often associated with exorcism and eliminating evil forces and breaking spells. However, Vajrakilaya is also another method for attaining enlightenment, because it is believed that the purba embodies all of the power and the wisdom of the Buddhas. And in fact, the great Yeshe Tsogyal, who was one of the royal consorts in the imperial period in Tibet, was a practitioner of Vajrakilaya under the guidance of Padmasambhava. And this tradition of the Vajrakilaya practice is what led her to her own personal experience of enlightenment. So it is rather interesting that our scholarly, learned, monastic Khenpo A Cho, by the way, Khenpo, as several people have pointed out to me, is a title in the Nyingma lineages, not in the Gelugpa lineages, so he's always known by that Nyingma title. Here he is practicing something that connects him directly to the imperial period in Tibetan history, guided by the great Dudjom Rinpoche, one of the great scholar practitioners of our time. And Dudjom Rinpoche had him sit on a special throne during the initiation, as if to say, this particular monk has some unusual gifts. And you will see what will happen. Okay. So we approached the hermitage with a great deal of reverence. We were met about halfway along the trail by several nuns and lay practitioners who guided us and insisted on carrying our backpacks for us. And we arrived, we made our respectful prostrations and gathered flowers, red and yellow flowers, to put on the altars. And we were greeted at the gate. The Lama on the right is Lama Pia, who was one of our guides. He is a relative of the Khenpo, who is the chaplain to those nuns that I mentioned. And the Lama on the left is Lama Norta, who is also a relative of the Khenpos, and he looks like a monk, but actually he's a lay practitioner. He's what you call a Nakpa, right, an expert in the mantras. Right? And he was one of the close disciples and one of the eyewitnesses that we interviewed. And you can see there's a stockade and this very beautiful environment and this very humble eremitical environment around the cell of Khenpo. And these are some of our friends, lay disciples, and there's a young California boy there, John Morgan, who came along as a porter, as a bearer. He wanted to experience this, and so he gets the good karma of having been there with us as well. But several young monks, lay disciples, nakpas, and nuns. And this is the chamber in which the Khenpo used to do his practices. He would sleep in the lotus position. He would not lie down. So this little box was his space for meditation, study, and rest. The adornments and the portraits were put there by his disciples because this is the spot where he died. This is the spot where they saw at the moment of his death, when he breathed his last, that his face had changed. Now, within moments of his death, they see this luminous quality. The flesh becomes pink like that of a small child. The wrinkles disappear. And so immediately they sent runners 50 miles to the west to consult with the Dharma brother of this Lama, whose name is Lama Akchun, who is his brother in the Dharma and in the Nyingma tradition. What do we do? And he said, cover the body with a cloth, venerate it, do your prayers and mantras and so on, all the rituals. In 8 days, there will be a Padmasambhava ceremony on the calendar. By that day, you will see what you need to see. But don't interrupt the process. Don't touch the body. Don't expose the body. Okay, so they just did that, and they could see day after day that the body of this frail elderly monk was diminishing under the cloth. And there were rainbows in the sky, some of them of unusual shapes, like straight bands, or triangles, or trapezoids. And there was, at one point, a very large manifestation of light, a sphere of light in the atmosphere that was seen at a great distance. So not only by people near the hermitage, but by people at a great distance who reported about it. And there was mysterious, wordless music that could be heard. And as someone said, if anyone had a tape recorder around here, you know, it certainly wasn't coming from a tape recorder. And also the classic sign of a very gentle rain, which is called a rain of flowers. Okay, metokcha, this scent of flowers. This is really just a fine rain that took place at that time. So they all reported in the interviews. I made a set of questions, a standard set of questions about what happened, and they all responded pretty consistently to the questions. Here we are interviewing Lama Piak and Lama Norta inside the hermitage over a cup of tea and some vegetables and so forth. The classic way. These are the nuns, by the way. nuns. When the nuns gave me the 9th chapter in their monastery, I began reading some portions of it. I can read, the Tibetans find me rather funny. They call me the Jesus Lama because they know that I do some kind of puja, you see, the Eucharist. I celebrate the Eucharist. And they rather like this puja that I do. I like to do a Gregorian chant and take my time with it and sit in the lotus position while I'm doing it. So they call me the Jesus Lama. But they also find it rather amusing that I can't really speak Tibetan fluently, but I can read it aloud fluently. They had never known anyone that could, because normally, of course, a child grows up speaking the language and then secondarily reading it. But this child, can read it but can't speak it. Of course, as you well know, colloquial, idiomatic languages are quite different from formal, classical. It would be like I can read Shakespeare aloud, but I can't talk like an Elizabethan. So, why did Brother David want me to do this research? Obviously, Brother David had been engaged for many years. I can document it back to 1966, when the Vatican actually gave him formal permission to not only engage in dialogue with Zen Buddhists, but to learn Zen from Zen masters. There's an actual letter that when I was his secretary back in 1978, 79, the letter, I found the letter in the file. So he was given permission not only to study about Zen or dialogue with Zen, but to practice under the direction of Zen teachers. And so he had many years of experience in that regard. Why was he interested in this phenomenon, this paranormal phenomenon connected with a lineage in Tibet? Well, it comes down to the fact that Brother David had been in dialogue with people in the Jesus Seminar. Do we know what the Jesus Seminar is? Okay. So there you have a lot of the situations in which we have the classic problem of textual study and critical study of texts that in some respects gives us results. After all, what did they want to do? They wanted to find out what Jesus most likely really said. Among all the sayings of Jesus in the New Testament, what are likely to be the most plausibly original and authentic sayings, which is a perfectly fine body of research. There's nothing wrong with it. But unfortunately, alongside that research is a kind of skepticism about the overall historical content of the New Testament and early Christian writings. And Brother David was particularly upset, if I might use that word, about the skepticism with regard to the resurrection, in which people were saying the resurrection was a subjective experience of the disciples and not an objective fact of someone who came back to life from the dead. All right? And this is expressed in many different ways, but I'm just giving the general thrust of the argument. So David said, there's no point in simply asserting the resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. We also have to know something about the human capacity to achieve such a result. There has to be something in our human experience that can confirm or deny the possibility of such a thing happening. Now, I could go on all night about this, but even one of my ancestors on my mother's side experienced one of those, where they die, a person dies apparently, and they're getting ready to take the person out to the church and bury them, and all of a sudden they come back to life, all right? In the case of this particular ancestor of mine, he was a young man, a lawyer, a politician, but he really wanted to be a priest, and he seems to have had some kind of a spiritual crisis, and he died, of this spiritual crisis. So there he was, ready to be taken to the burying grounds, and his mother called his spiritual director and said, "We have to do something. We can't let Francesco just be buried. There's something terribly wrong here. And so Father Giuliani, who's his spiritual father, says, if Jesus gives him back, will you give him to Jesus? All right. And so she said, yes, anything. And so Giuliani threw himself on the body of Francesco and prayed for him to return to life the way Elijah does in the Old Testament. And he did come back to life. He did come back to life. This is reported by no less a witness than St. Alphonsus de Liguori, who was the founder of the Redemptorist order. You know, Most Holy Redeemer Parish in downtown San Francisco was originally founded by the Redemptorists. And so this ancestor of mine became a Redemptorist. He became the novice master and a very highly regarded person. And St. Alphonsus said, this man is a living saint. This man is a living saint. But he had that experience. So there are such experiences, but that's not the same thing as the rainbow body, and it's not even the same thing as the resurrection, right? It's, you might say, near-death experience kind of thing. So there are experiences like that. In Tibet, there are experiences of near-death that are frequently the experience of women, called delok. The delok is a woman who seems to have died for several days, but has journeyed into the afterlife and comes back and reports on what she has seen and informs, for example, she informs the family that certain prayers need to be said to redeem or rescue or purify the deceased of that family. We had just recently in Italy, there was a woman named Natuzza who used to do this. She would go into a trance state every Thursday, go into the other world, and report on the situation of various people who had died, and say, you know, how many masses or rosaries or whatever have to be said to help that person. All right, and she was very famous for this and highly respected for that. So we had that, at least in Italian Catholicism. I don't know.
Say her name again, please.
Her name was Natuzza. And there are even some biographies about her. So this is, maybe we don't have that in the Bay Area yet, but we should. We should. Might be handy. But in any case, that kind of experience is known. But this dissolution of the body is even more difficult to explain, right? But at the same time, it seems to correspond to the idea that there is light involved, okay? And as we mentioned, there was a sphere of light in the sky, and there were reports of rainbows even before the Khenpo died. So light is involved. Some people speak of the dissolution of the body into light, as if matter is becoming energy. Okay. And then we go to Brother David's other interest, which is the Shroud of Turin, the Holy Shroud. Probably the most studied relic of all times. And as some of you know, back in, I think it was in 1987, there was the famous carbon-14 dating of the shroud, which came up with a date sometime in the 13th century. All right, in which case the shroud couldn't possibly have been the burial shroud of Jesus. Now, what this research couldn't explain were all the anomalies that nobody had ever depicted or fabricated an image of Jesus that looked anything like the man of the shroud. You know, the nails are in the wrists, not in the palms of the hand. There's endless details that don't correspond to the standard iconography of the crucified Christ. But not only that, the fibers of linen were altered by what seems to have been a burst of energy, an intense burst of energy, that altered the nature, denatured the fibers of linen just at the surface of the cloth. Right? And other factors that can be calculated in, the blood stains and other things, that would indicate that from the time of death until the production of the image, there were about 36 hours, which is the traditional number of hours that Jesus was in the tomb. All right, so there's a great deal to be said about this relic, which has been studied by a great diversity of scientific methods. I would say only one thing about the shroud. As an artist, not the world's greatest artist, but I can assure you that that image has no style. It has no style. It doesn't look like anything else that was ever produced by an artist. The greatest realist imaginable always has an element of personal style. There isn't any in the Shroud. It was not made by an artist. It's not an artifact. So Brother David is also convinced that the Shroud gives us an idea that a light or energy phenomenon is involved with the resurrection, thereby tending to push us towards an exploration of the rainbow body as a possible other way of arriving at the resurrection of the body, all right? Which becomes defined at that point as the transformation of the material body into a body of light. When we interviewed our eyewitnesses in Tibet and then later in India, none of them reported on an image imprinted on cloth. So the intensity of the experience of the resurrection of Jesus is one thing, and the dissolution of the body over a period of days in the rainbow body phenomena seem to be different. I mean, there are some distinct differences. Nevertheless, we're still talking about light. And we still seem to be talking about what is at least in part an experience that can be meaningfully thought of as a human experience. Okay. Some of you may also know about photoluminescence, right? And there are studies that indicate that a normal human body does radiate energy to some extent in the band frequency of visible light. All right, so all of us are, in a certain sense, already light bodies. At that point, we might begin to imagine that in some of these extraordinary lineages of contemplative practice, someone had hit upon a technique for enhancing the photoluminescence of the body in such a way as to bring about some paranormal phenomena at the time of death. Okay, we'll leave it at that for now. And I'd like to take you a little bit into the journey of the book. My introduction attempts to show the reader why this research is so difficult. Here we are talking about a paranormal phenomenon, something therefore that is very difficult to duplicate in the laboratory, very difficult to verify or falsify. You have to rely on interviews. You have to rely on testimony. You have to rely on written accounts that may be centuries old and which may have been written in order to glorify the life of a saint rather than to tell actual material facts, right? It depends on a sensitivity to the feelings and the cultural sensitivities of people in different parts of the world. Right? There are people who speak about their own culture, their own traditions in a certain way. You can't just go in there and tell them, now you have to talk about this my way. You know, you have to talk to me scientifically. What's the hypothesis? What's the theory? You know, what do you demonstrate? Well, wait a minute now, I don't even know what you're talking about. You know, let me tell you what happened. You know, this kind of thing. So the anthropologist is challenged to think differently, to think creatively about the human imagination and the way we express our life-changing experiences. And we also know that death is one of the most controversial and difficult experiences in every human community, in every human family. I start off by asking the famous Italian village question, che fine ha fatto? Right? Che fine ha fatto? It's a question that is asked almost cynically, right? Somebody goes off maybe to Australia or America or Argentina to make his or her fortune, right? Did they succeed or did they fail? What became of them? Can we gossip about them? Can we tell funny stories about them? Can we ridicule them? Can we admire them? Can we tell our children about them as a warning? All right, all of those things that happen in villages when people get together and talk. Right? And then how did they die? Did they die happily surrounded by their loving friends and relatives? Or did they die, you know, in the poorhouse or something, or some terrible disease. Right? People have a narrative about death that is a way of speaking about the person who died, but it's also a way of talking about the meaning of life and the values of a community, not all of which may be positive. Not all of which may be positive. So we have a lot of sorting out to do. And so in the introductory chapter, I try to raise some of these questions about context and about insider view and an outsider view of what's going on in the community. The next chapter gives you the raw data of the research. And the editors told me, why are we doing this? Questions and answers and all this. So I want the reader to see exactly what I said and exactly what the answers were to my questions. All right? So that the method there is a pretty rigorous series of questions and a conversation about those questions. And I did make an attempt in reporting on this to catch at least some of the explanatory dialogue that goes on between giving the answer and then getting a translation from a translator who spoke Tibetan better than I do, all right? And so in some cases, a lot of explanation had to go on between the question and the answer. So I tried to present a little bit of that, because in those conversations we hear how difficult it was, even for eyewitnesses, to understand the kinds of questions we were asking, even though the questions were asked in Tibetan. Right? But what are we getting at? What are we getting at? The other thing in the fieldwork is that I was able to check with a number of people. For example, we have here two friends of mine who were with me when we were talking to Lopan Tenzin Nandak, who is a Bonpo master who lives in Kathmandu, and very generously for several days was willing to meet with us and explain things to us in considerable detail. And while we were there in 2001, and then I think also in 2003, but 2001, an episode similar to the case of Khenpo A Cho began to take place in Tibet in a Bonpo community. And this particular episode finished rather badly, because what happened is the monk began to show signs of paranormal phenomena at the time of his death, but then his nephew began to interest journalists in the phenomenon, and there was an interference with the process, the very thing that Lama A Cho warned against, right? Lama A Cho warned against. And so as a result, the authorities stepped in, and the body had to be cremated, after a very embarrassing episode. But what this tells us is that something was going on, you see. In some ways, a negative experience can have the effect of providing us with evidence of verification and falsification, the famous problem of verifying or falsifying claimed evidence. Normally, when things go wrong, people don't want to talk about it anymore. But we were there, and the telephone calls were going back and forth from Tibet, so something was going on. Okay, there's grounds to have a conviction that something indeed occurs. What it is, all of its implications, that will take many, many lifetimes perhaps to figure out, but certainly something unusual takes place. After fieldwork, we have a chapter that goes into Dzogchen as a theory and as a practice. So the great perfection methods are expounded in great detail on the basis of the more recent and more detailed written sources by the great masters, such as Longchenpa in the 14th century, some of the great masters of the 17th and 18th centuries. So what we did was we went into these texts and we tried to expound what the textual tradition is. What does it mean to have a direct experience of the primordial state of the mind, to encounter the primordial purity of the mind, the kadak, the primordial purity of the mind, to encounter non-conceptual luminosity, right, as a contemplative experience that is simultaneously understood to be forever present, but accessible only to a few gifted individuals. Right? And what are the implications of that? And I try to clarify this particular area because it's a very difficult topic and very detailed, and compare it with the teachings on the traditional Buddhist tantras, which are different in many respects from the Dzogchen tradition, and to show why, where those differences lie, and why they seem to result also in a different kind of Buddhist realization. Then, we want to look at spirituality, broadly conceived, in order to illuminate the history of great perfection in Dzogchen itself. And in this, we are very fortunate that we have texts that have come down to us partly in the Nyingma canon. All right, some of the great Dzogchen tantras, like the Kunje Gyalpo, the text that talks about the arising of all phenomena, as if a great king were making everything. Samantabhadra, the great primordial Buddha. So that this illustrative language is used, but to describe an experience that is impersonal and non-dual. Okay, and there are some practices described in that text. Then there are much older texts that are available even today online in the Tibetan original and in translation that were found at the oasis of Dunhuang. Dunhuang is an oasis site in what is now northwestern China, which was the northernmost garrison of the Tibetan Empire in the 8th century. And in Dunhuang, in about the year 1016, someone decided that the time had come to seal up the caves that contained a number of extremely important manuscripts and a great mass of administrative and historical materials as well. And in fact, it's as if they put together just about everything that they had and sealed up the cave, probably in fear of an invasion at the time. Something was going on. So these caves were opened around 1912 by Paul Pelliot and Oral Stein, and the manuscripts that could be recovered were to some extent brought back to Europe, mainly to Paris and London, where a number of people like Sam Van Schaik have been studying them, and these texts are now cataloged, and many of them have been translated. Many of the texts were Buddhist. There were some Manichaean texts. In fact, there was a great quantity of Manichaean material, but it was almost all lost because there was a leak in the cave. And so the tens of thousands of pages of Manichaean manuscripts were lost. But some of those manuscripts were found in other oases, and Professor Klimkite in Bonn has published those. But there were also a small number of Christian texts written in Chinese that were found at Dunhuang. And these texts are extremely interesting for many reasons, but let's just focus on one. We have a book called The Book on the Realization of Peace and Joy, written by a Christian Chinese monk named Jingjing in the 780s, the very time of the high point of the Tibetan Empire, the time of the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet. It is probable that this text in classical Chinese, a luxury manuscript by the way, was composed intentionally to instruct the Christian community in China in classical Chinese on Buddhist and to some extent Taoist teachings that caused perplexity among the Christians. So what you have is Jesus presented as a bodhisattva, luminous, surrounded by an assembly of his disciples, answering the questions of perplexity of St. Peter on point by point an analysis of Buddhist teachings such as vipassana, insight meditation, the realization of emptiness, the realization of non-action, the correct understanding of merit, and acquiring or not acquiring merit, right? The nature of the virtues, and a great many other topics. So that it's a Christian theology making use of Buddhist terminology. The best translation of this text that I've been able to find, there was an English translation done in the 1930s by a Japanese scholar, Dr. CIIS, and I have his work at home, but a much better version in a modern language is by a young Italian monk who is an expert in medieval Chinese. His name is Matteo Niccolini Zani. And he's published a very fine translation of this material. So he gave me permission to translate it into English. Right, so in my book I've got a translation, but I also have a commentary, section by section, in which I attempt to explain both the Buddhist and the Christian content of this remarkable text. It is a Chinese Christian theology. Right? It clearly enters into a dialogue with Chinese Buddhism in a way that could not have been imagined by anyone who would simply think about Christianity and Buddhism as two worlds entirely different, two worlds that were entirely separate. But then we dig a little further and find out that our friend Jingjing, who was, by the way, a very prominent person in the Chinese Christian church, was friends with a monk from Central Asia named Prajna, a Buddhist monk, who was a Hu. And in Tang Chinese, Hu means someone from the western regions. He was probably a Sogdian. Right? Sogdia was one of the lands of Central Asia where the people were in charge of the mercantile activity across the Great Silk Road. And so Prajna and Jingjing together translated one of the Prajna Paramita Sutras into classical Chinese, working together. This was such a monumental project that some of the Buddhist community in the Tang capital sent a memorandum to the emperor telling him to scold Prajna and Jingjing, that Christians and Buddhists should not be translating texts together like that. But they did. But not only that, our friend Prajna was friends with Kobodaishi, the founder of the Shingon lineage, Tantric Buddhism in Japan, who was also in the Tang capital at that time. Okay? And he was studying with Amoghavajra, great Indian Tantric master, who was transmitting Tantric Buddhism to China. So there must have been one incredible little dialogue group going on in the Tang capital in the 780s, all right, of that remarkable century. All right. How is it that our Christians, they used to be called Nestorian Christians, we now call them Syro-Oriental Christians, and in my book I give a little bit of the history. How is it that they were prepared to encounter on such a deep level, not only linguistically, but also spiritually and theologically, to encounter Buddhism at its height in the Tang capital? Remember that it wasn't just Zen or Chan Buddhism. The Buddhism of the Tang dynasty was extremely rich, with numerous schools of thought. Many Sanskrit works have been translated into Chinese, and Chinese Buddhists were producing texts of their own. In the very same 8th century, at the beginning of the century, a monk from, get this, Qatar, all right, Persian Gulf, named John of Dalyatha, is producing some of the most remarkable writing, homilies and spiritual commentaries on the practices of the Syro-Oriental Christian monks. Right? This great church, about which today we know almost nothing and which is being destroyed in Iraq and Syria right now as we speak, this remarkable organization, international organization, which had its patriarchate in Baghdad, had bishops in South India and quite possibly also northern India, had itinerant bishops that accompanied the Mongol tribes in Central Asia, was creating one of the greatest theological academies of all time in Persia, had bishops in Tibet and China. This was the largest Christian body in the world at the time, bigger than Byzantine Christianity, bigger than Latin Christianity, and far more international, and ready to adapt structurally to the conditions of Asian life. But it was also ready to adapt intellectually and spiritually to the dialogue that it encountered in these cultures, because the mystical writings of the people like John of Daliata, Joseph Haziah, Isaac of Nineveh, Ephraim of Edessa, and some of the other great masters who were writing in the Aramaic language, we call it Syriac. That is the Christian form of the Aramaic language, which was already a lingua franca even in ancient Persian times, in the Sasanian dynasty. Aramaic was used in the Persian Empire. There's even an Ashoka inscription in Kandahar that has Aramaic and Greek, from probably 250 BC. Right? So this was the language that was used in Central Asia for ideas, for narratives, and for thought. And so these monks tell us things about the paranormal phenomena that accompanied some of the contemplative practices that their monastics at the highest level were experiencing. And that tradition in Central Asia and across the Asian landmass derives from a direct transmission to the Syro-Oriental Church from the Egyptian monastic centers which survived in the 5th century. All right? The 5th century. Remember that the Desert Fathers that we usually talk about are from the 4th century, but even into the 5th century there was a vigorous monastic tradition in Egypt. And we have evidence that even people whose theology was considered somewhat heterodox were welcomed into at least some of those communities and could study the old texts and learn the practices of meditation and liturgy and so forth from the masters who were still alive. And that tradition is traceable back to the figure of Evagrius of Pontus, who lived from about 345 to 399, and is very definitely the father of the intellectual and spiritual traditions of Egyptian monasticism, but through his disciple John Cassian, of Italian and French and Celtic monasticism in Western Europe. He is the father, through Maximus the Confessor and other greats, of the Byzantine monastic spirituality. The Philokalia is full of writings. Some of you may know the Philokalia, which is the great compendium of Byzantine spirituality. The writers that are in that compendium many, many times reflect the writings of Evagrius. Evagrius was condemned at the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, but his writings were passed along under other names, all right, or in abridged versions. For example, if you go, I think it's the 4th volume of the English translation of the Philokalia, and you find Peter of Damascus. All right, now I can't find anybody who tells us who Peter of Damascus was. I searched high and low for a biography of Peter of Damascus, but Peter of Damascus's texts are thoroughly imbued with the language and spirit of Evagrius. In Persia, the writings of Evagrius were translated into Syriac by Babai the Great, who was the great reorganizer of the Syro-Oriental Church. He was the patriarch, and he was also a genius, and he was able to translate those texts from Greek into Syriac. And there is another version in Syriac that is even more, it is even closer to the original Greek, that enables us to see what Evagrius' thought was. And among other things, Evagrius was not only an intellectual, he had a method. He had a method. We don't have time tonight to go into the method, but the method included things like giving people a short aphorism to meditate on in the course of the week in their cells, and then the Saturday night at the end of the week when all the monks would gather in the cell of the master, the Abba, all right, they would discuss the degree of insight, the degree of realization that the individual monk had achieved through the meditation on that aphorism. In his great work, the Kephalaya Gnostica, part of which is translated to my book, has 540 of these paragraphs, or Kephalaya, these aphorisms, that are to be meditated on sequentially. None of the chapters, there are 6 chapters, none of the chapters is focused on one single theme. And some writers have said, this is a hodgepodge. It's incomprehensible. What is this? Because the method is to enable the person to attain a more expansive vision of spiritual life. So to focus on one theme would be to make the mind more rigid, whereas this method forces the contemplative to pass from one aphorism to another, covering a broad spectrum of topics, chapter after chapter, in that spiral movement of spiritual progress. It's a brilliant achievement. It's a brilliant achievement, and I hope one day to be able to write a commentary on it. So all of this simply to say that the Christians of the Syro-Oriental Church who arrived in China were ready to encounter the Buddhists. There are other texts from Turfan, the Turfan Oasis also, that tend to confirm some of the same things that I'm asserting here. At the very time that the monks like Jingjing were writing, we have the earliest Dzogchen manuscripts at Dunhuang. And these early manuscripts illustrate a Dzogchen that is a scheme for interpreting Buddhist experience in the most radical and simple ways. The idea here is to understand even something as complex as Tantric Buddhism, making use of fundamental penetrating insights about the nature of reality. And those texts have fortunately been preserved and translated, and some of them are in my book and some of them are online. The 6 verses, the Cuckoo of Awareness, and some of the other works of that period. What I am claiming in the book is that the encounter between the Syro-Oriental Christians and the Buddhists that took place in China also impacted Tibet, precisely because we found the manuscripts all in the same place, the Huang, right? And that the conversation seems to have impelled some rethinking on the part of at least some Buddhists who took the risk of exploring 2 themes that we find clearly articulated in Christian thought, which were not fully developed in Buddhist thought until that time. And that is the notion of the physical body being capable of undergoing paranormal transformation that we call the resurrection. And the other is an eschatological goal or purpose to the entire cosmic process. Okay? And David Germano makes the case in his dissertation that, in fact, what we arrive at in the 14th century with a genius like Longchenpa in Tibet is the realization that, in fact, a karma-driven universe in which all that we see and perceive are driven by prior karmic experiences, which in a certain sense weigh down the base consciousness of the human presence in the universe, can be seen from another perspective as a gnosis-driven universe, a universe that is seeking a cognitive realization, a cognitive or Gnostic realization in which the universe itself is liberated, you see. Now what does the 8th chapter of Romans say? Precisely that, all right? This creation has been subject to futility, all right, by the one who was able to subject it to futility, so that now we can be liberated and achieve the liberation of all the children of God, right? This is the first, we're talking about the year 52 AD, right? And then this could not have been possible if there were not a profound exchange on that level. But then the beauty of the Tibetans, when we conclude with this thought, the beauty of the Tibetans is that they had access to some of the most extraordinary, I hate to use the word technology, but a lot of my colleagues use it, so I would use it provisionally, right, as provisional truth. They had the technology to develop meditative methods that produce extraordinary results on a very subtle level. And they had the contemplative institutions, the great monasteries, and the little hermitages out in the mountains, where you could actually try it out and do it. So they, inspired by what they heard and encountered among Manichees and Muslims and Christians in Central Asia, sat down, got back into touch with their own sources, and we have some of those very early sources, methods, and they carried it to an extraordinary level of development. And in the course of the centuries between Longchenpa, 13th century, and modern times, there have been numerous masters, especially in this Dzogchen tradition, that seem to have been capable of producing paranormal phenomena as a fruit of their deep contemplative practice. And they devised methods that went beyond the simple teachings of the early Dzogchen texts to make available to a wider public of practitioners those methods that would sensitize the human person to the potential of the human person. Okay? Like the great tantras like Chakrasamvara, Kuya Samaja, Hevajra, Yamantaka, and so forth, that were used by the larger schools of Tibetan Buddhism, the Dzogchenpas devised methods that would improve and enhance the ability of disciples to have these attainments. Okay? This was not the original idea of Dzogchen, but it became more and more important with both the impact from other cultures and religions, but also the infra-cultural controversies and debates that occurred in Tibet from the 11th century onward. Okay? And so that's where we get to the very strong positions that we hear expressed among the Nyingma practitioners. What we are doing is different from what the others are doing. And the others will also say, what you are doing is not even Buddhism. Okay? I mean, the controversy and the polemics are very strong on this. So I think my book attempts also to illustrate the impulses that lie behind the growth and development of some of the most sophisticated practices in Tibetan Buddhism, and helps us understand why some of them seem rather odd even to other Buddhists. We'll leave it at that for now and open it up for your questions.
Well, if there's no questions.
No, thank you. Other question. So I'm wondering about the implications of your research for the resurrection of Christ, and whether, in your view or in the view of some of your documents, the physical body of Christ might have dematerialized and a more subtle body might have appeared as a post-resurrection phenomenon.
Well, that's exactly, I think, what the New Testament is saying. Already in the year 50, with the first letter to the Corinthians, which is the old, First Thessalonians is the oldest Christian document, it's the oldest testimony to the resurrection. In the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, we have a more developed understanding of the resurrection as a soma pneumatikos, right? The spiritual body, right, of a different quality, all right, than the material body. So already there, we're seeing this insight. If you go to the supplement to the Summa Theologiae, where St. Thomas Aquinas takes up the state of the resurrected body at the end of time, you will see the same doctrine expounded in classic scholastic terms: subtlety, agility, ability to penetrate walls and travel instantaneously, and all of that. So this is part of Christian tradition. And remember that the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection of everybody are keyed one to the other. Right? And that's another feature of this conversation that needs to be emphasized. What Christ was, we shall be. All right? And the great quote of Leo the Great in the 5th century, that what will happen to our bodies later should now take place in our hearts. All right? It's rather important. In fact, going back here, this is the syllable hum being meditated on using the breath, but the hum is actually a projection of the heart in tantric practice. So, good question.
Thank you.
We can make this a very much a conversation, so please feel welcome. Yes.
Well, I kind of come from Robert's question, would like to know what is your feeling about Thomas's touching Jesus, or did that actually happen? And thus, what do you think from what you've studied? Because you probably are closer to the real truth of it.
I'm going to tell you a little story to illustrate that, because the subtle body doesn't necessarily operate only as a ghost, you see. When we were visiting Pondicherry, we were able to interview Tulsiram, I think his name is, the fellow who writes these great big fat volumes about Ramalinga Swami, Valalar, the one who's supposed to have attained the body of light in 1874. And we were told that sometimes Ramalinga will manifest in such a way as to touch or even slap disciples, to get them. Remember that one? The slap, right? So that there's a physical quality. Khenpo A Cho is said to have appeared to at least one disciple in retreat after his death. Right? So there's the appearance, but then sometimes there are these physical manifestations as well.
Because Jesus ate with the...
That's right. So the New Testament really strongly emphasizes that this subtle resurrection body of Jesus was also a real body, mainly because of the problem that they're trying to articulate of identity. Is this the same being as the one with whom we ate, the one who was our teacher, the one who died on the cross? Is this the same person? And so all of those stories emphasize experiences that would confirm the conviction that this is indeed the same person.
Yeah, the journey on the road after the resurrection, where they didn't recognize him until he was breaking bread with them.
So here again, this is the roots of the Eucharistic theology that says that what is present in the Eucharist is the body of the risen Christ. Okay, this is really important. Because of course the Christian is practicing the sacramental path that is supposed to bring about, you are baptized into Christ, and then that enables you to be incorporated into the person of the risen Christ. Then the Eucharist is celebrated and consumed such that the entire body-mind complex of the Christian will be assimilated to the Christ body, right, and become a spiritual body with him. And that's what Leo the Great is talking about, that it's a sacramental practice that brings about a transformation that will then be realized fully in the resurrection at the end of time. So the rainbow body is challenging, of course, our usual notion that you have to wait until the end of time. how many of you, of course, when we think about the biblical figures, that did achieve something like this, though there are some exceptions. Of course, the famous Enoch, right, who lived 365 years, and he's the father of Methuselah, who lived 969 years. Remember those passages from Genesis. Then there's Elijah, who was carried off to heaven, the chariot of fire, and then the Blessed Virgin Mary, who was assumed body and soul into heaven. And then, of course, there's also legendary material which the New Testament seems, if you really read it carefully, seems to confirm, is that Moses also was thought to be ascended. Remember that at the Transfiguration, it's Moses and Elijah who are speaking to Jesus. And there are apocryphal texts that talk about Moses also having ascended. Right? So I understand that in our own times, there's a whole lot of discussion going on in esoteric circles about the notion of ascension. All right, so that this is an idea that continues to captivate the imagination. And I would say that my book, I tried to be very sober in my book, all right, so that I'm trying to address different audiences and different sensibilities. But there are, of course, some websites and comments on, out there that are ultra enthusiastic, captivated by these things. And I think my book also will be an opportunity for people to reflect on the implications of that. I don't want to take anything away from anyone. I'm not a debunker, but at the same time, I think it's important to maintain sobriety and reflection on ends and means.
In your study, did you find any other indication of transfigurations also? Where I think this is also something that can happen currently.
There's a famous episode that I'm sure some of you will have read of Seraphim of Sarov, the great contemplative saint in Russia in the 1840s, or 30s, if I'm not mistaken, who at a certain point in an intimate conversation with one of his disciples manifested a transfigured form, radiated light. And there are a number of saints who either during life or at the time of death are reported to have radiated light. I rather like the case of Peter Celestine, who was, by the way, born in Isernia, is the Pope for a few months in 1294, a very controversial, brief pontificate. After his death, a ray of light emanated from his the place where he died for several days, as I understand. So there were these phenomena. I spoke with Eastern Orthodox monks in Romania about these ideas in 2002, and that was part of the research. And they speak a lot about relics, and relics in both Christianity and in Buddhism are often referred to as personal presence, as spiritual presence, and as a luminous. As a luminous. Okay. This is also an important way of framing our understanding of this.
Yeah. A lot of rich themes here. Questions that are coming up for me that I don't think anyone can answer. But one theme that's interesting here is I understand that there are sort of types or gradations of rainbow body or jalu and maybe some other related phenomena. So perhaps, for example, a teacher may, after cremation, leave ring cell or relics behind in the cremains that are then venerated as special objects, sort of pearl-like. But then there can be seemingly gradations of rainbow body where maybe remains are left, maybe less remains, or maybe none. And then there's a couple of illustrious examples of, is it Jalu Poa Chenpo, the great body of transference, manifested by Padmasambhava and Vimalamitra, where there's no remains, they pass maybe like Enoch, completely out of the realm of the physical, but aren't dead, and they remain sort of active and present somehow. And so I wonder if we're thinking, are these really just differences in degree? Are there differences in kind there? Are there differentiations we can make from your Christian and other Central Asian sources about all of this kind of thing?
Yeah, this just allows us to look at the vast diversity. Some of this is discussed in the 3rd chapter, but the main thing here is that a lot of the whole discourse about relics is easily understood. All right, you know, of course we always have to be careful if we understand something too easily, but it's easily understood as a discussion about relationship. Okay, it's a discussion about relationships between masters and disciples. So that in the case of Dujam Rinpoche, for example, if you go, I've forgotten the name of the monastery. It's in Bodha, but it's not on the side of the street where the stupa is, but the other side of the street. And in that monastery, there is a stupa that contains the shrunken body of Dujam Rinpoche, who was a large, boned, and heavy-set man. It's supposed to be about this big. I asked if I could get closer and perhaps even see it if it's in the glass, but they wouldn't let me in there. But I did have some interesting conversations with the monks there. But the point here is that his wife told him, don't attain the Jalu, the rainbow body, because we would like to have relics of you to venerate after your death, and you have responsibility to your sons and your disciples, all right, who need to have an object of devotion as a support. This is a key term in Tibet for the 10, the support, all right, for devotion. And even at the end of the manuscript of Khenpo A Cho, the words faith and devotion were the words that inspired a moment of extraordinary communion between myself and the nuns. Because when I was reading the chapter to them, and I said, isn't this what it's all about? All of us, one after another, started to well up in tears, you know. This is really a deeply felt reality. This isn't just some sort of abstract debate, you know. This is something people feel very strongly. So he did not leave relics, but he left something else in this case, all right? In other words, in some respects, I think the quality of the relationship between the Khenpo and his intimate circle of disciples was sufficient to keep alive the necessary faith and devotion. It wasn't necessary to leave relics, okay? But the sign was important because what are the times all about? The times are about surveillance, persecution, limitations, people escaping to India. It's a time in which some kind of paranormal message gives encouragement, right? And there are a number of things. Now there is something called the Relic Tour. Have you seen this?
It's been here.
Since 2010, I think that this has been, so that there are a number of different extraordinary paranormal phenomena in the form of material relics that are on display for devotion, but also to awaken faith. And I believe that that Lama A Cho, who supposed to have left a body about the size of a thumb, right? This was the fellow that we show you his picture. The Lama who's inside the booth, chanting the Gesar epic, by the way. He, you can see he's a pretty bulky fellow. He left a body with a relic that's the size of a thumb, right? And that's in the relic. And there are several other examples of this, and then there are the ring cell, which are a little hard to explain also. They're luminous, pearl-like, sometimes of different colors. There was a prominent Gelugpa master at Kopan monastery in Kathmandu, who is believed to have, there are photographs of rather extraordinary ring cell from him. So all of this tells us something about something that has almost completely passed out of our religious consciousness in post-Reformation times. But it is interesting how I believe recently Saint Therese of Lisieux was brought to America. Her relics were brought for devotion. And there was an extraordinary outpouring of interest. And some other people have told me about their extraordinary experiences in the presence of the Shroud, for example. I mean, it's really amazing how something is awakened by the paranormal qualities of relics.
I have a question about veneration and devotion. And some of us know or have read that the devotion, it's a translation, is the quintessential quality of heart openness to prepare one to receive the blessings and the transformative power of the lineage of realized ones.
Jinnah, as you're saying.
Jinnah. And I'm reminded that Lawrence Durrell, who was born in the Himalayan regions, before he wrote the Alexandrian Quartet, wrote a book called The Black Book, and in it he recites in phonetic Tibetan translation, where there is veneration, even a dog's tooth will emit light, which, and dogs in Himalayan regions are not these domestic cuddly creatures. They're very fierce guardians. These days there's a kind of inspired but perhaps wrong-headed notion that if one might say, the philosophical position which makes this opening via devotion possible, the mind, which goes all the way back to some of the earliest teachings of Buddhism, is that there's a kind of panpsychism. There's a kind of, you talked about Pace Germano, the cosmos is alive and knowing itself, and that this is like a cosmic kind of liberation. It raises great questions about the seeming insularity or thickness of separateness of so-called humans. This is my introduction to the following question. In Western and Asian traditions, there have always been reports of mediums, psychics, those who receive messages from not here, from the beyond, from the dead, intercessors, and sometimes if it's a religious community that's very strict or dogmatic, you have to say, well, it's through the blessings of Jesus, and if you don't, there could be repercussions, because one can be fooled, you know. So the questions of the value. And so the question that I ask here is, we have these understandings of the Central Asians and this phenomena of rainbow body and a kind of, we might say, insight or theology which supports this. What came up in your research, and maybe it's still dormant, you might flesh this out, for a kind of middle realm of intuitive devotional opening for which we have professions, recognized categories of psychics and mediums?
Yeah, this is, of course, whenever you talk to a Christian about psychics and mediums and this kind of thing, it sort of raises hackles. It's considered very, very dangerous in our tradition. So, what I had to do in the 1990s in my diocese, I had to assist the bishop with a number of exorcisms. And so in that period of my life, I had to deal with these problems, directly. And there were some people who became apparently possessed by entities as a result of ill-advised dabbling in mediumship. Okay. One of the most dramatic, but also the most easily resolved cases that we had was a case of a woman who was acting as a medium. And it was one of the very few entities that really did speak Latin of a sort and manifested various supranormal powers. Okay, so, but to get rid of that entity, the entity was there because the entity wanted to attract attention to itself, basically. It wasn't there by contract. The way, in a magical operation, there is an actual contract that is made, and the entity engages in destructive activities to destroy the person and those around the person who is the victim of the curse. So in that case, working with a very, very skilled exorcist, that entity departed, whereas others were harder to get rid of. There were a lot of interesting subtle phenomena connected with that. So in the case of the Asian phenomenon of trance mediums, here the Christian usually wants to stay at a distance. I did visit Dharamsala in 1997, and I was present on the full moon day for the manifestations of the Gadong Oracle and the Nichum Oracle, both in the same day. So that was quite a day. And I observed in those phenomena behaviors that were identified, of course, as the descent of a deity into the monk medium. The phenomena that I observed were different from the phenomena that I had observed in cases of exorcism. Okay. And so I can only say this, that it's different. It's definitely different. It may well be, as is said, some kind of a higher entity that is actually committed to helping, all right, the lineage in question. In this case, the lineage of the Dalai Lamas, right? So in that case, you have a phenomenon in which actually the policies, the public policies of a head of state are, you might say, seconded by a paranormal presence. Okay? And this bears further research, as does all this material too. And there is a great deal that needs to be done to explore the actual physical and perhaps other dimensions of the relics that we're talking about. So, I mean, forensic studies, everything that was done to the shroud should be done to these relics as much as possible. But the case of the possession and this is really, and there's also by a Sekharis study of the mainly women in Sri Lanka who are channels of deities, and this is another area of cultural anthropology that really illustrates the interface between the relationship of a particular kind, in this case marginal people, often persecuted and despised people, who are then taken up as the means by which the divine manifests. And in our own tradition, even though we wouldn't talk about it as possession, but isn't it true that almost all the apparitions of the Virgin Mary take place to this kind of person? People who were not thought much of, or children, or poor people, or marginal people. So, and indeed, even the rainbow body is frequently attained by practitioners who are precisely and even intentionally marginal. All right? Because their relationship with the community is decidedly different from that of a High Lama, that of a teacher, that of a master, who in some respects intends to aid his or her community for the foreseeable future, even after death. All right? Whereas the marginal practitioner may wish to manifest attainment of Buddhahood in a way that facilitates the kind of rigorous practice that's needed. Okay? Some people, I mean, as this Lama told us, you can come here, you can become my disciple, and if you work with me for 60 years, you might attain the rainbow body, right? In other words, he figured it was about a 60-year process to do it. You know? So, but the point is discipleship, the blessing, the relationship, and also, of course, in a certain sense, he's advising people to go into lifelong retreat. Lifelong retreat. You know, in some cases reported by Namkhai Norgul Rinpoche, the lifelong retreat takes the form of simply being a very ordinary person that no one would pay much attention to. And so, you know, here I am ruining all of my hard work of living in the mountains of southern Italy, you know, by talking to you. But I think that the time also demands that. Right? And so we'll see what happens later.
Send us an email.
Yeah, send you an email, right? We're just about to head back to the mothership. More questions? Yeah.
Father, sorry for my ignorance if I cannot say well. I noticed it's really a lot of Tibetan Buddhism explanations on this rainbow body, but on the resurrection side, on the Christian side, and you being a Catholic priest, how can you explain this more on the Catholic side? Like for me, I practice Catholicism. I practiced Tibetan Buddhism before, and how can this be more understood by lay people or practiced more? This resurrection, this rainbow body that a lay Catholic person can also understand.
All right. You know, when I spoke to His Holiness the Dalai Lama a number of years ago, it's almost, 20 or 30 years ago, about this question, and he suggested a very simple practice that everyone can do at any time. And so it's the classic, very simple Buddhist practice of visualizing in front of you our Lord in His luminosity, in His beauty and light, and allow that to come into our heart, right, through faith and devotion, right? Gustad, we have in Tibet. This faith and devotion allows that to come into us. And then, because we don't want to hold on to it, we want to allow it to touch us and transform us through faith. But then to imagine that this goes forth from us to everyone else. Simple as that. Simple as that. And in Italy, we have Namkhai Norgul Rinpoche, who's also in many places around the world, but he has a center in Italy. And there, one of the practices that he does is a little more complicated, but it's actually more or less the same idea, working with the letter A, you know, the beautiful sound of the letter A, and singing that sound, and it takes the form of doing it actually 4 times. So listen to this. The first time, you sing the letter A from deep inside your with a deep breath and all of that, and you visualize the sphere of light in front of you, which could be Christ. And then you sound the letter A again after you've contemplated that. In fact, what I do is I usually visualize the Eucharist, right? Because that is the principal nutrient of our spiritual development. In Catholic Christianity, we receive the Eucharist, so I visualize that. And then I sound the A again and allow that light to descend into me, right, and touch my heart. And then I sound the A again, and I allow it to come forth and activate all the positive energy of the universe, right? And then I sound it a 4th time, right, to simply rest in the presence, which is the state of contemplation, to welcome the gift, to welcome the gift. So it's visualize and contemplate with discursive meditation, allow to descend with faith and devotion, share, and then rest in the presence. And that can be done very slowly and meditatively in silence, And I believe it to be a very, very beautiful practice that doesn't require any of the ornamentation and complexity. You can enhance it with some breath exercises and the position of your body and so on. But basically that could be done even in a few moments while waiting for the bus. In our Catholic tradition, we have something called spiritual communion. And the prayer known as the act of spiritual communion is a very simple prayer that simply says, in this particular moment I'm not in church, I can't receive Holy Communion, but please come spiritually into my heart and unite me perfectly with you. Right? And I love that prayer. I've loved that prayer since I was a child. And it's basically putting into words what we are doing in that kind of practice. So I think that would be very accessible, and probably if you did this, on a daily basis, would probably make a real difference in the way we see things and the way we encounter life. I mean, even today, somebody asked me, do you ever get panicky? Do you get any butterflies in your stomach when you know you're going to be speaking to a group? And I said, funny thing, today I got a little scared this morning. I said, the other talks have gone well, so I shouldn't have. But subconsciously, we always have a certain amount of frailty, right? So then I said to myself, because this comes right out of this kind of teaching, wait a minute now. The feeling that I'm having, this clutch at my heart and my stomach and all, that's energy. That's a force within me. So instead of being scared by it, let me see what I can do with it, and release it and let it impel me, right? And so this is how, ad aspera, ad astra, right? Through asperity and difficulty we rise to the stars, right? Great Latin quote. It's true. You can dissolve your fear into a kick in the pants that gets you going. Right? And these things, when we learn to work with them, make life much more beautiful. The other day I was reading the story of a British psychiatrist who was one of the founders of the Tavistock movement. And he was quite a character, and he eventually did go to India and learn meditation. And he said, I'm working with all these depressed people and all these psychotic people and all these schizophrenic people, but when I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, I want to shout, hooray, hooray, hooray. I mean, he had so perfected his ability to work with even negative energy that he was a man full of joy. He had lots of kids. It was quite something. And he could deal with adversity. When he came back from India, he didn't have a penny to his name. Many of his children passed away, as children. And yet, there was this hooray, this joy, this vigor. And that's a real experience. That's a reality for people. I talked to to Jetsunla Tenzin Palma, the British woman who became now the abbess of a wonderful monastery for women in northern India. The joy is palpable with her. And she's not had an easy life, but she is, abounding in joy. And even these nuns, at one point we ran into them in the back and forth journeys, those nuns in Panza. And at one time, there must have been 25 of them riding on a tractor. One on top of the other, holding arms, and adorned with flowers. Adorned with flowers, and singing, and I just said, this is what life should be. It's just so beautiful. I mean, they really were quite extraordinary, these women. Yet they're living the most radical simplicity. The most radical simplicity, and yet such joy.
That was wonderful.
On that note, of course, we could go for some more period of time. In Buddhist traditions, when one has been greatly inspired, one not only thanks the presenter, but also plants the seed that they shall return. And so I would say on behalf of everyone here, hooray, 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 and may you return.
dedicated to merit, right? For all those who are suffering and those that we care about, right? So that too, in our hearts, each one of us. Thank you very much for your presence tonight and your kindness and your beautiful open hearts and the diversity that's present here that enriches.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.